And we know on Earth that natural resources are often, at the heart of some of the worst conflicts that we've seen. And so what can we do now that will set in place some basic norms and agreements so that we are coordinating and that there's transparency around the activities that are happening with natural resources there, and thinking, again, ahead of time about how to be good stewards of that environment.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Jessy Kate Schingler from Embassy Network and Open Lunar Foundation. Embassy Network is a really neat community project spanning a number of locations and has brought forward a lot of experiments around governance. In this discussion, we go deep into extitutional theory, a concept that Jessy Kate has helped bring to life, which really makes things explicit in how they relate to institutions. We talk about themes like salons, which is a format for community discourse, as well as dealing with conflict, funding, legal mechanisms, and other reflections and lessons learned from Jessy Kate, who's a real expert in these arenas. The last third of the conversation is about Open Lunar Foundation, an organization that is helping shape stewardship principles and frameworks around the lunar renaissance. And finally, we wrap up with Jessy Kate's comments about New Zealand. This conversation was recorded in April 2023 at the Eco Weaving Gathering. I hope you enjoy it. Jessy Kate Schingler. We're here today with Jessy Kate Schingler. Jessy Kate works in commons governance across local communities and intergalactic resource management. AKA, she is a founder of Embassy Network and Open Lunar Foundation. Welcome, Jessy Kate.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So before we get into the intergalactic stuff, I want to start with Embassy. You've been working on this project for many years. What is Embassy Network?
Well, Embassy is many things to many people. It's part of what I love about it. But it really started with a bunch of friends many of whom have been on this podcast and many of whom will still be, who met in the space community. And we met while traveling to conferences and had the experience of being just immersed in inspiration and collaboration, and kind of thought why don't we live like this all the time? And so as we started to live at the same cities, we decided to get a house together. And we decided, well, if we're going to live together, we should also make sure we have a guest room so that when our additional friends from around the world come visit, we have a place to host them. And then when they come visit, we want to make sure we have a big dining room table and lots of food around so that we can have a big conversation and, debate philosophies of the world and ideas about the future and all this stuff. And so we began to live together in this way, but also being from the space community, that is one where we're often thinking about what are the possibilities for humanity in the future, and that's kind of the motivation that inspires a lot of us to do that work, and so we're kind of well, if we're space nerds and we're living together in this environment and we're talking about the future of humanity, but it's not we're just going to kind of get to space and somehow flip a switch and humanity will be organized differently, or we will, we'll have different political systems or different social systems. Presumably we need to kind of start experimenting with that a little bit here before we go to space. So we were well, we have this house or this community, so maybe we can start to think about our living environment, not just as a place to work on projects, but also as a place to to undertake experiments about how we could be organized differently. So I would say that that element kind of wove into what really became the embassy. Also, as we were moving to California, and California, of course, has this like rich history of experimentation, intentional communities, communes, socialist movements, libertarian communities, like across the board. And so I would say we kind of like, we realized that we were in good company as we began to establish our community. And that, I guess that's where the name embassy comes from. Embassy, the idea of the embassy or the embassy network is places that are kind of embassies to the futures that we hope to see in the world. And the network part was kind of always implied by the fact that that we had met from so many different locations, that there's always this kind of undertone of travel and mobility as part of our community, and this question of like, how do we travel and always be at home? And so we, of course, by having people come visit us and going to visit them, we kind of developed implicitly a network of spaces that we're in and are in collaboration with each other and kind of mutual support. It's a good start on embassy.
So what is like the rough size, the scope of the network, number of locations, number of years of development?
When we started calling this thing we were doing the embassy network, we spent a lot of time thinking about what's the formal structure and how are these different locations going to relate to each other, and are they autonomous spaces, or are they centrally, like, are we going to go start a bunch of spaces, or are they going to come to us? And is there some accountability there? Like, what's the kind of protocol? And we actually kind of, let's say, like, we wrung our hands about that for a long time, partially because none of the institutional models that we were familiar with really like resonated for us. And actually, it was around that time that I ended up meeting some friends from something called the Inspiral Network. And for me personally, that was very much a time where I went from feeling really sheepish about not wanting to institute like a sort of really formal structure around this notion of a network, and not really understanding why, or not having a reference model for what the alternative was. Like, I kind of just felt like I was failing to do something as opposed to uncovering an alternative way of coordinating. And I met this community of people in New Zealand who were already experimenting with governance, who were already experimenting with participatory budgeting, and it was just this moment of like total like feeling seen, or like legitimization and permission to kind of dig into what are other ways of organizing. So that didn't totally answer your question, but in terms of what that means and meant for the embassy network, I think we went from trying to define what it means to be in relationship to just being in relationship with other places. In practice over the years, that's looked like a lot of different things. Sometimes it's looked like being listed on our website so that people can find these spaces and indicate an interest in going to stay there. Sometimes it's meant participatory budgeting across locations. Sometimes it's meant people sort of like working on projects across those locations. We have, one of the things that we have is a gigantic Slack community. And there's like, I think there's a couple thousand people in that space right now. And it's just full of folks who are part of these kinds of experimental self-governing spaces around the world. And so what that allows is anytime there's an idea for a project or a collaboration, people just start a channel. Like it's very emergent. Nobody's managing it, or nobody's there's some very lightweight kind of like if there's egregious behavior in that environment, then that's one thing. But otherwise, people just sort of do their own thing.
So many people have touched Embassy Network now, roughly in the thousands, I guess. Have come definitely through, and this has been going for what, better part of a decade?
Yeah, the building that we call the Embassy has been kind of under our stewardship for about a decade. Before that, we were living in a community that we called Rainbow Mansion in Cupertino for about 5 years before that. So I'd say the core group of people who found ourselves kind of kicking this off have been in relationship with each other for a good 20 years and living in community together for 15 or 16, which officially makes us old, but that's another story.
And it sounds like there's kind of a hot spot of activity in addition to California and New Zealand. That's kind of a lot of like-minded experiments and projects. Presumably, some of these different groups in Europe. We talked to Faye.
Yeah.
Are there any other kind of like hubs or spokes where there's a lot of activity?
There have been over the years. We have good friends and collaborators in Puerto Rico, some in Japan, some in Spain, quite a lot in California. I would say, as is the case with these projects, sometimes they're ephemeral, sometimes they last 5 years, sometimes 1 year,
Totally.
It totally depends. Faye is a really special connection to our community in the sense that Jess, who started Chateau du Faye and Faytopia as a project within that container, we met her when she came to California to study intentional communities and architecture, and kind of found herself with her professor in our house, studying us, which actually we've worked with architecture students quite a lot, and it's always very inspiring. And we try to keep the good ones around. So after her course ended, she came to live with us for a while, and at some point she decided to move back to France and start this project. But it very much when she was getting that started, we were in a lot of communication about what she was doing and what she was excited about. Something I love about the Faytopia experiment that has never been a pattern that was easy for us to do within the embassy is the temporality of it, the fact that it's a seasonal project. Has obviously there's a lot of differences in that, and some pros and some cons, but being seasonal means that the challenges of people wanting to be kind of at large in the world are I would say not as great. It becomes somewhere that you go for a few months every year, but when you have other things to do in your life, you're not sort of abandoning the community. You're kind of at large, and you come back to kind of like regroup the following year. It's really interesting from the perspective of governance and decision making. You don't have the same kind of institutional knowledge, but you also have an opportunity to reset and say, what do we want this year to be like? How do we want it to be different? So there's this natural cadence of sort of like learning loops and reflection that is harder to institute in an environment like the embassy that's full time and year round.
Right. And we had a great conversation with Jessica Fleur Angel from Faye. If people want to learn more about Faye, we also had a great conversation with Joshua Weil, one of the founders of Inspiral,
yes,
and other folks that have touched and been a part of Inspiral. And it is interesting to see the commonalities experiencing kind of embassy network more recently for myself, where it does feel like this is very culturally similar to experiences I've had with the Inspiral network.
Cool.
And it's like field building, where there's like cultural norms that start to emerge in different locations, and then they spread and cross-pollinate. And that must be very satisfying for you to see people taking the experiences at embassy into other locations. Yeah. What else gives you juice? Like, what else is gets you really excited about this line of work?
Well, recently, I would say, as we were coming up on, I guess, it's sort of like 12 years at this particular location, and we're thinking a lot about questions of longevity and kind of sustainability, and looking at the definitions of success. Like, is persistent success? What makes projects persist? And, persistence can often be a kind of death in the sense of ceasing to change or innovate. So, we've been thinking a lot about structure, I would say. And one of the things that was so let's say, provocative in a rich and positive way about spending time at Faye myself was that I was able to compare and contrast how the different environments worked and the role that I had played at Embassy for many years and the role that Jess plays at Faytopia. And we started to have conversations about what is the relationship between the kind of institutional aspects of these projects, these communities, and the more, like, we didn't have a word for it at the time, but it was like this, the emergent, relational, collaborative something that's going on. And if you talk to some things that are common across both, if you talk to people who've spent time there, you say, well, actually, you don't even have to ask them. Many times people will say, I am part of Faytopia. I'm part of Embassy. But they don't have a role. Like, nobody's ever said, this is your official title. You are recognized by the institution. Many of them wouldn't even be able to tell you how the institutional aspects of those spaces run.
Right.
And yet they have this very strong sense of identity and identification with the project. And we were really interested in, like, how does that happen? And like, how does that happen? And how do you name that? Because if you were to say, like, let's say every time somebody said, I feel like I'm part of Faytopia, and you were like, great, now you are an official Faytopian. Even that, like, fundamentally changes the conversation, because now it's like, well, why did I get to be an official Faytopian and you did it? And what am I accountable to now? And is there a way that I might get ejected from being a Faytopian? And all of these questions follow from that don't seem to come up in the same way when you just have this more relational way of relating to the project. So we ended up giving this concept a name, and we called it Extitutional as opposed to institutional, and just naming it as a way to kind of interrogate it. Say, well, what if we have this institutional infrastructure that's around, but we have this other thing that's happening over here, and it's not that it's outside of the institution, because the institution is fundamentally necessary. Like, I think, but if you took away the entity that has a bank account, that pays the rent, that gets the insurance, that does all this stuff, you wouldn't have, in these cases anyway, you wouldn't have the extitution, the thing we're calling the extitution. So there's some symbiotic relationship there. And we also see times, I think many of us have examples in our lives where we see communities or projects that have a great community, and then they try to institutionalize it, or they say, this is awesome. How do we kind of like put a bow around it or a box around it? And it dies, because you go from having this emergent behavior to like the official community coordinator who's telling you you've got to show up and have fun like every Friday at 3 p.m. And it doesn't work in the same way. And so how could we became interested in studying that symbiotic relationship between the institution and the extitutional dynamics. And that's a project that we've been working on for the last few years.
Yeah, at some level, it's clearly working, because you have this incredible network that is coming back over and over and meeting each other in different places in the world. And like, that can't be said for most community experiments. I'd love to dig into like some of the lessons that you've learned, practices, tools. Maybe one to start with is salon. When you came to
that's right.
Mongaroa Farms, you brought this social technology of salon, which everyone loved. It was just like kind of like being quenched, and you didn't know you were thirsty for it. And it was like, oh, and I heard a lot of comments from folks on the land of like, yes, we need more of this.
Cool.
So can you talk a bit about what is salon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that practice really started, I mentioned the time when we got a big house and we had a guest room, and we decided we'd have big long dinner table to have these discussions. The practice is really about, I would say, intentionally crafting a conversation on a topic that is of mutual interest. There's so many different ways of holding a salon. Like we often we've done them over big dinners, but we will also do host them where we invite somebody to kind of say a few words about something, introduce them for like maybe 10 minutes, and then you open up the conversation to a wider group. And yeah, I think as a social technology, as you say, it's just a really nice pattern and a way to give ourselves permission to kind of like nerd out on a topic. And part of what I love about it is that it's this balance between inviting some framing so that you have a kind of backbone to the conversation, but then by opening it up, it becomes a peer-based conversation. It's not that anybody's telling you where you need to end up. Sometimes you might have disagreements, strong debates, or end up something that's completely off topic, and they really benefit from having a diversity of perspectives in them. So yeah, it's just simple way to explore ideas together.
Yeah. So an example would be like, I could be like, I want to host a salon on the ethics of animal agriculture, and tell the community on the Signal group from the WhatsApp group, like, hey, this is what I'm doing, and if you're interested, it's very voluntary. People who show up are the ones that are meant to be there. Yeah. Maybe over dinner, maybe not. And then there's permission, if I'm the one organizing the salon, to kind of like frame things, start things out, get on the podium and talk about what I want to say. And yeah, it's a way to go deeper as a group, but then there's also very much a collaborative peer-to-peer space of facilitation, and people give their comments and feedback, and it turns into more of a discussion. And I mean, is there anything else in terms of facilitation that you think is really important around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess this is a bit of a mix and match thing, but sometimes we might send out some like inspirational readings ahead of time. Something that isn't super mix and match is like, it's really nice to try and get as many people who are present to be able to have a voice in that conversation as possible. So there is a delicate balance in terms of facilitation of allowing for kind of passionate exchanges, which sometimes are not kind of like nice and inclusive. Sometimes there is this moment of like thrashing back and forth. But then you want to balance that with making sure that people, like the people who are quietest, are often doing like the most internal thinking and work, or maybe they're the most challenged by the topic. So that's something that I find really valuable is to make sure that we pause at various points and sort of say, okay, like this person might have spoken 4 or 5 times already, but this other person hasn't said anything. Other things I love to do are make sure that we're taking notes so that there's follow-ups on either like key insights that people had, and sharing the notes in a way that people can add to those notes if they want, if they feel something was missed, sharing references or follow-ups, and sometimes even having 2 speakers introduce a topic from different perspectives so that you kind of give permission to disagree right from the outset. Right. And you almost establish like the Overton window for your conversation so that people are like, oh yeah, it's okay to have that, like that perspective that I thought was really crazy, but now that person has named it. So I can be like anywhere in this space between these 2 people. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think there's just like the subtlety of, it's not, hey, we're all meeting as a community, let's sit in circle. And then that kind of puts this context of like, well, we need to kind of have equal amount of voice time. And like, maybe, if it's a contentious topic, it kind of automatically, okay, like there's a implication that we're like, as a communal body, finding our point of view on something. It's not like that. It's more of like, I'm really dealing with, the balance between, my professional career and having a family. And like, I want to like just kind of work this out with a group discussion. And so there's that permission and that space to one person to kind of to start and to get that space set up. And And yeah, like the ability to just go in one topic and geek out, like that can happen organically over a dinner conversation, and it does. But there's something about like naming it salon and then having that like meme, if you will, then be a thing.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, we're calling it salon night, you know, who wants to join? And like, and so that, yeah, it just really struck me. That was a really cool social technology.
I mean, we've been, I guess, using this practice, you know, our whole communal lives, for lack of a better description. And we, when we used to run a space called the Red Victorian in the Upper Haight of San Francisco. So it's like, you know, Haight-Ashbury. It's the kind of belly of like, you know, the 60s, like summer of love, communal, everything movement. And we had this like incredible, just like bohemian kind of anarchist hotel situation. It was amazing. And it had a really big commercial space on the ground floor. And so that's like a storefront that was open to the street. And so we'd host these salons, and a lot of them were like science salons and like neuroscience, or like, you know, agricultural science, obviously a lot of computer science. And you would have them like completely open to the street. So people would walk by and there's like a sandwich board that's like salon on neuroscience happening now, or like political science. So we'd have like kind of internationally renowned academics coming in and talking about their work. And people would just like stumble in off the street and be like, what is even happening here? And, you know, it's anywhere from like 15 people to 75 people, I would say. And for the academics, for them, it was just like to have such a kind of like informal environment to discuss their ideas was also really rich for them. And to be able to have everyone from like a guest visiting from, you know, like another country to somebody who is unhoused come in and be in the same conversation together, was just like a lot of fun for everyone.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, because I think of people on the outside, they hear, you know, Haight-Ashbury, Rainbow Mansion, San Francisco, like, you know, there can be a lot of projection of like, well, these are like, I don't know, everyone's getting high, sex parties and like whatever. Yeah. But
there's plenty of that too. Let's be clear. But
but it's really like, I mean, you were doing like, you know, hackathons at Rainbow Mansion, and it's got like a kind of a very bubbly intellectual, my experience, which is still fairly limited, but like there's very deep substantive projects, topics, explorations, you know, people who are very serious in terms of the work that they're out doing in the world, coming together in these like kind of new synaptic, unexpected collisions and creative sparks and so forth. Yeah, it's just something that seems like it's important to people and beneficial.
Yeah. Well, I'm biased, but I enjoy it. You were asking earlier about patterns and sort of like patterns that have worked or technologies that have worked. And one that I think has always been really important to us is a kind of balance or ratio between, I would say, like, I guess there's different ways of putting it, but like the existing community versus new energy or new people. So whether that lands as like, sometimes we think about that in terms of long-term residents versus people who are travelers in one way or another, and or frequency of events or other ways of having kind of like new inputs and new stimulus. It has always been really central to our culture, and obviously there's like so many other ways of doing it, but for us, it's always been really central to have these. I would say, you know, sort of like, I think of it as like 30 to 40% new material, new energy, new inputs, because otherwise we just end up really internally focused. And especially when you're dealing with a group of people living together, it's really easy to get caught up in like the dishes aren't done, or like, why isn't this place clean, or like just sort of spiraling into something that lands more like bickering. But if you have new input, then there's almost something that like focuses and concentrates the reason you're coordinating and collaborating in the first place.
Right.
And then it's like, oh yeah, well, here's a reason why we might want to have the dishes done. And also here's a reason why, even if they're not done, we don't really care that much because we're really inspired about this discussion about agriculture or whatever. So
right.
yeah.
How do you do really kind of, what's your approach to conflict management?
Varied, obviously, in the sense that so many different ways to have conflict. Something that I notice I've become more comfortable with over the years is talking about people and issues more out in the open, I would say. Like one, as a response to, or almost like a preemption of conflict, when things come up that feel potentially tricky, what I notice when the community is healthy, what I notice is that we actually spend a lot of time, like literally around the kitchen, chopping blocks, so to speak, like talking about, oh, did you notice this person seemed like they maybe felt uncomfortable about that? And like, actually, I happen to know that they have this background, and, and this maybe was influencing how they responded there. And it's something that I would say could land as, and if done insensitively, could be gossip, but actually with done correctly, or done, in the way I'm thinking about is really about kind of processing group dynamics together and understanding and trying to like peel back the layers of how we show up as people. So that's one, I would say, like underlying thing that I see happening in our communities that is a positive contributor to conflict resolution. But then there's a lot of, if there's like an actual acute conflict, I would say there's a range of tools and approaches that we've deployed, from like many people make themselves available for being a third person in a conversation that might be really difficult, or even some like side processing, it's sort of like, hey, Matthew, how should I, like this person, pissed me off about this thing. I don't really know how to say it, and I'm not even really sure what I want to say. Right. And kind of practicing that, like regular kind of conflict resolution stuff. We've hired people like mediators externally when something is like when we're too close to something.
Got it.
In the house. So, it can be tricky sometimes, but also you get a lot of practice with interpersonal dynamics, and that's fun too.
Yeah. On that point, I see myself as fairly introverted. So, even coming to this gathering, I was talking to Chelsea, who we also spoke with, Chelsea Robinson.
Yeah.
And she was like, don't worry, Matthew, Jessy Kate models being introverted yes. in a large group. She'll literally be reading a book while everyone else is right there having a discussion. So, you have that modeling available to you. How do you live with so many people and like be surrounded by so many people, and then also find time for yourself?
Well, I will always say that I think in a funny way, being introverted means that a communal environment is like the best place to live, because I can be maximally lazy about, and like even avoidant of social interaction. But when I leave my room, I can either like kind of stay focused, which does take some practice, or I stumble into something that I didn't expect. And I didn't have to like take the metro across town for an hour or like pay $20 for an Uber. Right. I can like really organically find myself in a conversation that is really interesting, or meeting a new person. And I can also participate for 10 minutes and then leave. And that's like completely socially acceptable and very much expected, especially from friends who know you well and know that you like to do your introvert thing. So it's like to have people who love you and support you to be who you are, and have low barrier to social interaction is a very nice way to be an introvert.
Nice.
Obviously there's challenges to it. There's sometimes where I'm like, I really just want to go make, like a sandwich, and I can't.
Right.
So
Without
it's
running
not
into
perfect,
7
but
people in the kitchen, right?
yeah. But it is what it is.
And I see that you hold a lot behind the scenes when it comes to the finance and the legal aspects of all this. We'd love to just hear a bit more about like how do you afford to create these types of projects? Like what's the revenue model? How do you create sustainability and funding and also the legal side of things?
Cool. My favorite topics. First, I think maybe the best first order analogy for the like operating model, the institutional operating models of these projects tends to be like a small business or like even like a nonprofit small business, like a lifestyle business somewhere that needs to cover its costs, but is probably less opinionated about making a profit, right? And that also differs from space to space. The spaces that I'm involved with are generally not-for-profit spaces or spaces where if there is a profit, we are collectively making decisions about what the surplus is used for. I guess unsurprisingly, the way that we finance them is very similar to small businesses where you start off and you're like, well, what our initial costs are going to be a deposit, like first and last month's rent. It's going to be furniture, which, if you're dealing with like a 7,000 square foot house, that's not a trivial part of your expenses. It's probably going to be some initial vacancy that you want to make sure you account for. And you basically, what we've done typically is we get a loan from just friends. So you cobble together like, $5,000 or $10,000 from a few different people. It's San Francisco. So, we're talking like to start a community, it's probably like WAG, it's like $50K, right? And then we have set it up typically so that the initial funds that are loaned to the project, we design a financial model based on rent and guest income that would be able to reimburse that loan at 5% interest over some number of years. That's usually like, I would say 2 to 5 years, somewhere in between that. And when that works well, obviously we could talk about when it doesn't work well as well. But when it works well, one of the nice things about that is that you're usually, because you have people cycling through over the course of the life cycle of the project, you're usually paying off through that loan and the income from the house or the community. You're paying off that deposit as well. Which means that if you get it back at the end, you can then actually use that to like redeploy it to another project somewhere. And we've also, within our community, when we have been in periods where we have more coming in than we need, often we have given or lent money to other communities. And separate from the income from the house, one thing we've done within a nonprofit we actually have something called the revolving loan fund that was just one donor put, I think it was 30 or 35K, donated that to the nonprofit, and then the nonprofit lends to communities so that if you don't have friends who have 5 or 10K that you can cobble together $50,000 from, that you can still get these projects started. So that's kind of how we've started it. And
how transparent are the finances in the communal conversation?
So transparent that we've gotten in a lot of trouble with the city of San Francisco for sadly I had to take some of them down, but I had these amazing, in my opinion, blog posts about our participatory budgeting process with using CoBudget, which is an Inspiral tool that we used to use when we had a lot of guest activity, which is part of how we got in trouble with the city. What we would do is we would calculate the number of person nights that everybody had in the house over the course of the month, and that's residents and that's guests. So obviously it goes from like 30 nights to 1. And we took our surplus and we basically distributed it pro rata per number of person nights to everybody who had stayed with us. And so if you were a guest and you'd stayed for a week, you might get an email like a few months later once we found the time to do the math and say, hey, you've got, $73 to spend. Where would you like it to go? And it was really fun, because people were like, holy crap, like,
nice.
That's really cool. So that was, we've always been very transparent about the finances. In Slack, we have what I think is still an open channel with our, like every month our financial reports get posted. And for us, that is a bit of almost like advocacy around financial literacy.
Totally.
Because it's like, it's easy to say it's not a mystery when you're familiar with it. But I think there is a lot of kind of obfuscation of these, the operational aspects of these spaces. And I've become fascinated by it because also when I go out and I meet, like Chateau du Fay is structured very differently, right? They've got like other activities that happen over the course of the year. They have a full-time staff. It's Jess's full-time job. It's a very different circumstance. So there's so many different kind of legal structures. There's also just like costs that I didn't think about at the beginning. Like, insurance is a major cost for us. Taxes every year and having bookkeepers on board, and like, it's not sexy stuff, but it all needs to happen. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is back to sort of lessons learned, but I think we started off on these projects kind of feeling like it was a placeholder to have a subset of us on the let's say like legal and financial accountability. And we always had this feeling like it's kind of this like shameful abomination that it's not everybody who's like exactly equally sharing in all this responsibility. And over the years, what we've discovered is that, again, when it's working well, and of course, we should always look at when it doesn't work well, but when it's working more or less well, people, actually in this case, even when it's not working well, not everybody wants that legal and financial responsibility. And so, you're like, hey, I've been thinking really deeply about all the ways that like, I'm going to empower you by giving you this legal responsibility. And people are like, actually, I'm good. Thanks. So, like you can hold that, you can have it.
You take the liability. I just want to be a guest.
I just want to like show up and have some, good food, or people will, actually what I think is interesting is that, yes, on paper, we do have a very small subset of people who are financially and legally responsible, but in practice, day to day, we do take shared financial responsibility, and we do buy the food together, and we do host guests together and host events. And so there's this kind of like, these different, they're almost like independent layers, that don't really see each other. And we have to look a certain way to like the IRS, for example, and we do. But then within the community, the sense of ownership and accountability is totally there and distributed. But then it's like, well, if we already have that sense of accountability and ownership, why do I need to be like, fill out a bunch of paperwork and be an officer on a corporation that, is like for what? So, navigating that and seeing how opinions change over time and in different circumstances is I think really fascinating.
Yeah, I love the way you said there's like two different layers, because that's how I experienced it a lot in New Zealand and in other land projects. Like that, it's complicated to even just understand what the rules are, especially at these intersections of tax and tenancy in many, probably all jurisdictions. And then, it's actually not very conducive or compatible with kind of the visions of what often these communities are trying to do around collectivization and new models. And so you're also trying to kind of like figure out and grope through the dark, new space in that way, dealing with cultural headwinds against you and, money traumas and legacy issues and diversity of opinions, and like putting those two together. It's tricky. Yeah. So any other final thoughts on like how you hold all of that and balance the finance and legal implications?
Well, just that the work that we've been doing in extitutional theory has, I think, brought me around to thinking about that design question slightly differently, and thinking about it more as how do we, in some cases, that it's actually really effective to design a kind of firewall between those two environments that you were talking about. Whereas, again, I used to think of it as a failure to merge those two domains. And, we've actually begun to talk more about the like benevolent dictator role, and how that kind of like minimum surface area for the formal rules and roles allows for an exploration of the more relational aspects to be front and center. And so, yeah, still like so much more to learn there. But I think that's been a really generative kind of direction to start working on.
Yeah, I've been appreciating all the random jokes about benevolent dictators. Yes. Okay, so core group of space geeks doing all of these different local community experiments and projects. And you also have birthed a project called Open Lunar Foundation. What is Open Lunar?
Open Lunar is a nonprofit that we started about 4 or 5 years ago now. It was started initially by a group of technologists and space people who were looking at trends in launch costs and reducing just like technology costs in general, and the emergence of certain NASA programs focused on lunar exploration, and seeing the ways in which that was leading to an increased amount of activity in the private sector and also in international governments for going to the moon. And as technologists, knowing how quickly technology can change and seeing that there wasn't really anywhere where the conversation was being had about what kinds of precedents are we setting, and how do we want to be good stewards of this kind of like not just another celestial body, but also in some like literal and metaphorical sense, like the first step that we will take as we begin to, over like hundreds and thousands of years, go and have a greater presence in the solar system and beyond. And so we decided to start this nonprofit that would be able to engage specifically in questions of governance and policy around lunar activity that could look, I would say, like just over the horizon of where certainly, governments are focused on programmatic work. The Artemis program is NASA's program to go back to the moon. NASA is not a policy agency. It's an engineering organization. And so NASA isn't mandated to think about how do we do natural resource management on the moon. They're mandated to fund a drill, And similarly, you've got the private sector that is starting to develop these capabilities. And there's a number of missions, there's about, I would say like 10 going to the moon in the next decade. And, we just saw, sadly, what's called in polite company a hard landing on the lunar surface a couple of days ago. But, there's so many different actors that are going to the moon now. And unlike missions of the past, not only are they a more diverse set of kind of mission operators, but each of those missions has, possibly dozens of instruments or payloads on them, each of which might have an independent operator with different values, with different intentions, possibly from different country. So you've got like this mess of jurisdictions and questions about accountability and intentions. And also, it's also a really exciting time. Like Open Lunar is not about saying, it's not about finger wagging or about saying we shouldn't be doing these things. It's actually about, again, as technologists, it's about like an excitement for what's happening and asking how do we do it in a way that will allow us to sustain that excitement along with, being good stewards of that environment.
So it sounds like what you're saying is like the technology is accelerating and advancing. There's a lot more happening in and around the moon.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, like, I love how you put it, like NASA is not a policy agency. Like, it's like, so, but there are obviously lots of other considerations just besides engineering about our relationship to this celestial body, especially when you have so many different diverse interests, whether they're different countries, different corporations, like different public and private interests sending payloads up to the moon.
Yeah.
And so like, Are there other groups doing what Open Lunar is doing? It sounds like what you're doing is kind of informing and kind of stirring up discussions around different policy and ethical and governance considerations in and around this this advancement towards the moon.
Yeah. Certainly, we exist in an ecosystem of other thinkers and actors. There is a sector that is focused on space policy more broadly, and there's a number of really good think tanks in that area. There are also companies and people in governments and sometimes government projects where they are asking questions about sort of like coordination or standards or policy making. And then there's initiatives. Certainly, there's sort of like regulatory and rulemaking initiatives within the federal government, many federal governments, and then at the United Nations level, there's initiatives. But most of those are very slow. And I think a lot of the time in these kind of smaller ecosystems, they're taking cues from the sort of like nonprofit civil society sector. But also Open Lunar, I think as we kind of got into understanding the range of issues that we think kind of at play, issues like debris and disposal, like what will we do with spacecraft when they reach the end of their operational mission lifespan? Do they just become junk on the moon, or do we have some way of collecting them or disposing of them? How do we make sure we don't kick up dust that influences other actors? If you go and you extract resources from the lunar surface, we think now that from a governance and policy standpoint, there's a merging agreement that you can do that and that you can own it. But do you have certain responsibilities or accountabilities to that? Are there limitations on where you can extract resources and how you can extract it? So like all of these questions, as we have gotten involved in that work, we've become particularly interested in ways that we can take that like litany of questions that I just kind of rattled through and design operational interventions that might help to guide, sort of like scaffold and guide behavior in ways that both support exploration and development while having some kind of like mutual accountability around them. So some examples of that, I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is that we started off kind of writing a bunch of policy papers, and then we're like, well, that's nice, but like, I don't know, what happens then? We're just sort of like telling the world that we think these are good ideas. But in some cases, and I'll give a couple of examples, in some cases, we think there are some really evident ways in which with a small intervention, you could actually kind of instrument behavior that would make everybody better off. So one example that we've been working on recently is a program that's focused on timekeeping in the lunar environment. And that's something that is important for coordination. And on Earth, we have something called UTC. It's a global standard for time, and it's managed by an organization called the International Bureau of Weights and Measures. And they actually average time sources that are contributed from like 60 different countries around the world, and possibly even some non-nation state contributors. And that's really important to international trade, obviously like shipping, trading, like our own mobility. And there's a long and really interesting history of how like GMT was agreed upon at a conference called the, I think, International Meridian Conference that was held in DC. And it was like this big political discussion. And now we, it's easy to appreciate why having a shared reference for time on Earth is important. But in the lunar environment, we don't have any of that infrastructure yet. And so I think it's not surprising to say that a shared time reference would be useful. But what's happening in practice is that you have like Europe and the United States are thinking about what their communication network is going to look like and what their standards will be. And they're beginning to fund some work that will result in some, let's say, like Western actors offering time service. And meanwhile, China has a relay satellite that's already in orbit around what's called the Lagrange point, L2 Lagrange point, or at the moon. And so like you can quickly see how you might end up with 2 different time standards, and time is the ingredient that helps us know where we are. GPS is basically your position from 4 different GPS signals from 4 different GPS satellites, and so we if we don't have a shared time reference, then all of a sudden we might end up in a debate about whether or not you have crossed the threshold that we agreed that you wouldn't cross. Or if I want to relay information back to Earth, can I only relay with satellites that are using my time standard? Or if we're all on the same time standard, then it makes it easier for everybody to use the assets that are kind of in play. So we have become interested in that topic, and so we've been studying it, but then we're also looking at what are the actual like instruments or payloads that we could deploy in that environment, and how might you operationally like bring together the actors to talk about how they would use that time reference and sort of scaffold into shared utility in that environment. So that's the kind of project that we think is really interesting.
So you're setting time standards for humans in outer space.
Well, hopefully a bunch of people will come together to set time standards in outer space. There's one other project that, I could talk about a number of projects, but one that I think is really important that we're working on is related to, I would say, like natural resources and how we as humans want to coordinate our use of those resources, whether we want to coordinate our use of those resources. And so that broadly speaking, outer space is governed by one primary treaty. It's called the Outer Space Treaty. And the Outer Space Treaty establishes space as a global commons. And that specifically the phrasing is that there shall be no national appropriation in outer space. And there's all kinds of ways that you could kind of like dig into that or sort of complicate that, and people do all the time. But it's, as a baseline, it's taken to mean that we can't have territorial appropriations. You can't go somewhere on the moon and plant a flag and say it's mine. But if you dig up like a cup of material, you can say it's yours. So it's a bit like the high seas or Antarctica or something like that in terms of it being a commons. But beyond that kind of initial prohibition, there's no rules and there's no agreements about how and when you can do those things. And we know on Earth that natural resources are often, at the heart of some of the worst conflicts that we've seen. And so what can we do now that will set in place some like basic norms and agreements so that we are coordinating and that there's transparency around the activities that are happening with natural resources there, and thinking, again, ahead of time about how to be good stewards of that environment.
That sounds very important. Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is like natural resources being at the heart of so much conflict here on Earth, and we don't really have yet norms and policies and an understanding of how we're going to do this in space. And the technology is advancing such that it's time to think about it. Yeah, starting with the moon. Yeah,
well summarized.
How do asteroids fit into all of this? Is it like, are we going to be mining asteroids anytime soon? Kind of silly Space 101 question.
Well, they are generally speaking quite a lot further from where we are. There have been some let's say initiatives that were interested in this in the past. They're further from us. Our understanding of their composition, it tends to be lower because there's so many of them and it's hard to study them in detail, like any one given one in detail. Unless you're landing there, you're using remote sensing. Our remote sensing capabilities are not typically sophisticated enough to be able to say, not only this is the composition of the asteroid, but also this is the kind of the way in which these resources are distributed within the asteroid. So all of this actually applies to the moon as well. Like we don't even really know on the moon. We know there's water ice in various places, but it's quite low amount of water ice. Like the analogy that is maybe helpful for our reference is it's like in the most wet environments on the moon, you might have water molecules distributed at roughly the amount that you would find in like the driest desert on Earth. Like it's, but we don't know if it's like a ball of ice or like suspended molecules kind of distributed around within other materials. And so again, all of this applies to asteroids as well. But in general, it's just the overhead to understanding what you'd be going to mine is a lot higher. Also, you start to deal with really wacky stuff like if you land on this asteroid, depending on its size, and it's like you try to drill something, you might launch yourself off of the asteroid. You might also cause the asteroid to break apart entirely.
Right.
Then you have to think about bringing it back. Like it's just, it's kind of a mess, which is part of why I would say the most advanced thinking around, it's called in situ resource utilization in space is focused on in situ. It's focused on not bringing things back to Earth, but really how do we use the resources there in order to enable a sustained presence somewhere where we could have a research base station to be doing work, to be doing science, that kind of thing. And bringing it back to Earth is like a whole other ballgame.
Well, you're helping me no longer ever see the moon the same way. And yeah, I get the sense that this is going to be an arena that we keep hearing more and more about in the next decade. So my last question for you is, I know you took a trip to New Zealand recently. Just so curious, any reflections? What did you notice and observe, and how did that impact you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've been to New Zealand before. And so my initial connection with New Zealand was really through the Inspiral community, as we were talking about earlier. And so in that sense, I had a feeling of coming home. And so that was, it's a nice way to start, of course. But because we were there for an extended period of time, we were there for several months, I guess I was struck by the realization of how many sort of, I don't know if it's like ways of being or practices that I have really valued deeply in my life, I think have roots in New Zealand, and in particular in New Zealand's encounter with its Maori and Indigenous communities, and the way in which those cultures have kind of come together. And obviously it's not perfect, and there's a lot of work to be done there, but I guess in terms of practices around facilitation, intentionality, resource management, like we were just talking about, sort of across the board, I just feel like so much gratitude to that environment for existing. And it's, it's such a small country, and I may not be in the most mainstream circles, but like in my world, that the impact of what New Zealand has created has just been like totally outsized. So that was, so that's the thing that's really sitting with me.
Nice. Jessy Kate, thank you for your time and all the work you do. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, what'd you think? Please leave us a comment below. For more information, you can go to embasynetwork.com and openlunar.org. There's links in the show notes. You might also be interested in the conversations we had with Chelsea Robinson from Open Lunar Foundation, Robbie Schingler from Planet, as well as Tony Lai, Primavera de Filippi, and Jessica Flor Angel. You can find all of those discussions and more at maearth.com. See you next time.